The phone buzzes in my hand. Elena's name flashing across Mark's screen with words that shouldn't exist. Cabo transfers complete. My husband's surgery gives me 4 hours to uncover the truth. I swipe past his passcode, fingers shaking, but the stairwell door slams open. Mark's security lunges for the phone. My laptop bag swings hard, buying me seconds to freeze our accounts. Then David's voice cracks through the lie. I set up the transfers. I thought you knew. The man who balanced our books just signed my financial death warrant. The surgical waiting room of Mount Sinai smelled of industrial bleach and burnt coffee beans. Sarah Miller traced the jagged edge of a plastic chair arm, her thumbs snagging on the frayed molding. Across the tiles, a janitor's mop hissed against the floor. A rhythmic, wet slap that filled the silence between the hum of the vending machine. Mark's iPhone vibrated in her lap, a frantic mechanical insect. She picked it up to silence the ringer, but the screen illuminated her pale knuckles. A notification banner popped up, glowing against the dim light of the lobby. Elena. The name sat there, stark and unapologetic. Is he out yet? I can't breathe until I hear he's okay. Sarah's chest tightened. She swiped the glass, the surface slick with her own perspiration. The thread unspooled in a series of blue bubbles. Photos of unmade beds, voice notes she feared to play, and a message from 2 hours ago. Tell her today. We can't keep hiding in the guest house. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She scrolled further, her eyes stinging. It wasn't just an affair. There were spreadsheets, screenshots of bank ledgers showing transfers to a shell company in Cabo. Mark, her husband of 12 years, the man currently lying on a table with his chest cracked open, had been planning to leave her for months. But he wasn't just leaving. He was draining her. He was moving their life into a digital vault she wasn't supposed to find. Sarah is breathing, she whispered, her voice a ghost of a sound, as she pulled a small silver recorder from her coat pocket. Sarah is looking at the screen. Time is 9:14 a.m. The subject is Mark Miller. The evidence is mounting. The act of narration grounded her. It turned the betrayal into data. Data could be managed. Data could be fought. She looked up as a nurse entered the area, her rubber soles squeaking on the linoleum. Sarah shoved the phone into her pocket, the metal casing burning against her hip. Mrs. Miller. The nurse clutched a clipboard to her chest, her expression unreadable behind a paper mask. The surgeon is finishing up. There were complications with the internal bleeding. Sarah stood, her knees locking. She opened her mouth, but her throat felt lined with sand. Complications, she echoed, the word tasting like copper. Dr. Aris will explain everything. Sit, please. Sarah sank into the chair, the phone vibrating again. A ghost of a secret pulse against her thigh while her husband's life hung on a thread feet away. She didn't sit for long. The panic was a cold tide, but her administrative mind was already building a dam. She needed to know how deep this hole went. She slipped away from the surgical lounge, her movements precise and hurried, heading toward the hospital cafeteria where the noise of clattering trays and the hiss of espresso machines might drown out the sound of her own crumbling life. She found a corner table tucked away from the windows. She pulled out the phone again. She knew Mark's habits, the way he cracked his knuckles before a lie, and the way he used his wedding anniversary as a fallback for every password he couldn't remember. She tried 0612. The screen flickered and unlocked. Sarah is accessing the drive, she murmured into her recorder. The gate is open. Her fingers flew across the glass. She found the Files app buried 3 screens deep in a folder labeled Work Boring. Inside, it was anything but boring. It was a roadmap of a heist. She saw folders for offshore accounts, legal filings for a divorce she hadn't been served, and a contact named David Sterling. David, their accountant for a decade. A man who had sat at their Thanksgiving table and complimented Sarah's stuffing while, apparently, helping her husband rob her blind. She dialed his number, her hand shaking so hard she almost dropped the device. Sarah? David's voice was small, tentative. I heard about the surgery. How is he? The surgery is ongoing, David, Sarah said, her voice a flat clinical blade. But I'm looking at a transfer. $3.2 million. Moved yesterday at 4 p.m. to an account in the Grand Caymans. Tell me why Sarah is looking at an empty joint account. There was a long, agonizing silence. Only the sound of David's heavy breathing and the distant clink of a spoon against a ceramic mug on his end. Sarah, you shouldn't be on that phone, he whispered. Mark said, he said you were handled. Handled? Sarah's grip tightened. Verify the transfers, David, now, or the next call is to the precinct. It's true, David stammered. Several million. It's been moving in increments for 6 months. I thought you knew, Sarah. I thought it was for the tax shelter in the islands. He said it was your idea. The betrayal tasted like scorched dust. Sarah ended the call without a word. She needed to move. If Mark's security was as thorough as his accounting, she wasn't safe in the open. She stood, her chair screeching against the tile, a sound that felt like a scream. She headed for the stairwell near the oncology wing, a place she knew would be deserted. The air here was stagnant and heavy, smelling of old wax and stagnant air. As she reached the landing between the 3rd and 4th floors, a heavy steel door groaned open above her. A man stepped out. He was massive, his neck a thick pillar of muscle, wearing a cheap suit that strained at the shoulders. He didn't look like a doctor. He looked like a wall. Mrs. Miller, the man said. His voice was a low rumble that vibrated in the small concrete space. I'm going to need that phone. Sarah retreated a step, her heel clicking sharply against the concrete. Who are you? I'm the person who makes sure Mark's interests are protected. And right now, you're a liability. He moved with a surprising, predatory grace. He reached for her, his large hand closing the distance in a blur. Sarah didn't scream. She didn't have time. She swung her heavy laptop bag with both hands, the weight of the metal casing and power bricks inside acting like a flail. It caught the man squarely on the side of his knee. There was a sickening crack, like a dry branch snapping. The man roared, his leg buckling. He collapsed against the handrail, the metal groaning under his weight. Sarah didn't wait to see if he'd get up. She lunged for the door, her lungs burning, and burst back into the bright, sterile light of the hallway. She ran toward the parking garage, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Sarah is moving. She whispered into the recorder, her voice trembling. Sarah is surviving. She reached her Volvo, the interior smelling of the vanilla air freshener Mark hated. She locked the doors, the mechanical thunk providing a momentary illusion of safety. She pulled up the banking app on the phone. She had the credentials. She had the access. With a few frantic taps, she triggered a fraud alert and froze the primary joint account. The screen flashed a satisfying green. Account suspended. A shadow fell over the windshield. Sarah jumped, a small cry escaping her throat. It was David Sterling. He looked haggard, his suit rumpled, his round face pale and sweating. He tapped on the glass, his eyes darting around the garage. Sarah lowered the window an inch. What are you doing here, David? I had to come, he wheezed, leaning against the door. I couldn't just let it happen. Mark, he's not the man you think he is, Sarah. He's been using me. He's been using everyone. Sarah felt a flicker of hope. This was it, the ally she needed. David had the keys to the kingdom. He knew where the bodies were buried. Help me, David. Help me get it back. We can go to the firm. We can stop him before he wakes up. David nodded fervently, his eyes glistening. I want to. I really do. I've kept logs, Sarah. Everything he made me do. We can burn him down together. Just let me see the phone. Let me see which accounts you've flagged so I can match them to my ledger. Sarah felt the tension in her shoulders drop. She wasn't alone. She unlocked the car door. Thank you, David. I thought I was losing my mind. She handed him the phone, her fingers brushing his. Relief washed through her, warm and thick. David took the phone, his thumb hovering over the screen. He scrolled for a moment, his face softening into a smile. You did well, Sarah. You really did. You found things I didn't think you'd ever see. We can go to the police now, right? Sarah asked, her hand reaching for the ignition. David didn't look up. His smile didn't fade, but it changed. It became something sharper, something colder. He began typing a sequence Sarah didn't recognize. The police? No, Sarah. That would be a mess for everyone, especially for me. Sarah paused, her hand frozen on the key. Something was wrong. David's posture, he wasn't slumped anymore. He was upright, his movements precise. He wasn't looking for ledgers. He was navigating the administrative settings. David, she whispered. A cold prickle danced across her skin. You see? David said, his voice now devoid of its previous tremor. Mark didn't just hire me to move money. He hired me to be the fall guy if things went wrong. But I'm a better accountant than that. I made sure that if I go down, you go down with him. Those transfers you just froze? I just unfroze them using the override code Mark gave me for emergencies. And I've just initiated a final sweep. Sarah lunged for the phone, but David shoved her back into the seat with a strength she didn't know he possessed. The screen flashed red. Transfer complete. Balance, $0. What have you done? Sarah gasped, her world tilting. I've secured my retirement, David said, stepping back from the car and pocketing the phone. And I've made sure the digital trail leads directly to your laptop. By the time Mark wakes up, you'll be the one the firm is looking for. You're the disgruntled wife who tried to rob her husband while he was on the operating table. It's a very compelling narrative, don't you think? He adjusted his tie, the movement rhythmic and calm. The man who had been her friend for a decade walked away into the shadows of the garage, leaving Sarah in a car she couldn't start, in a life that no longer belonged to her. Sarah is alone, she whispered to the empty car. But the recorder was gone. David had taken that too. The cold of the parking garage seemed to seep into Sarah's very marrow. She sat in the driver's seat, her hands gripped so tightly on the steering wheel that her knuckles were white as bone. She had no phone, no money, no proof. The silence in the car was absolute, broken only by the distant, rhythmic thud-thud of a construction crew somewhere on the streets of Manhattan. She needed a phone. She needed to reach her own bank, the separate account her father had left her, the inheritance she'd kept in her own name, a small fortress of independence she'd never touched. She stepped out of the car, her legs feeling like lead, and walked back toward the hospital entrance. She spotted a yellow taxi idling near the ambulance bay. The driver was reading a newspaper, the smell of cheap tobacco drifting from the open window. I need to get to Brooklyn, Sarah said, her voice cracking. I'll pay you double when we get there. I left my purse in my office. The driver looked at her, his eyes scanning her disheveled hair and the smudge of concrete dust on her coat. Cash or card up front, lady. Rules are rules. I have a card, she said, reaching into her pocket. She pulled out her personal visa. She swiped it through the reader on the partition. Declined. Try it again, Sarah urged, her heart skipping. It's a good card. There's plenty of money. The driver tried again. Declined. Reported stolen. Sarah stared at the small screen. Mark. He hadn't just moved the joint money. He had anticipated her every move. He had flagged her personal accounts, knowing she'd try to use them to flee or fight. She was a ghost in the system. Out, the driver grunted, gesturing to the curb. Sarah stepped out, the humid New York air pressing against her. She reached into her purse to find her car keys, thinking she could at least sit in the Volvo and think. Her fingers brushed against silk lining and a stray lipstick, but the heavy metal jingle was missing. She dumped the bag onto the sidewalk. A compact, a pen, a pack of tissues. No keys. She looked back at the garage. David. He hadn't just taken the phone and the recorder. He'd reached into her bag while she was distracted by her own relief. She was stranded. Sarah is losing ground, she whispered, her habit of narration returning even without the device. It was the only thing she had left that Mark couldn't steal. She retreated back into the hospital, seeking the anonymity of the crowds. She found a family restroom on the second floor, locking herself in the stall. The walls were a pale, sickly green, and the air smelled of lemon-scented ammonia. She sat on the closed lid of the toilet, her head in her hands. She needed to see the damage. She used the hospital's guest Wi-Fi on her tablet, the one thing she still had in her bag. She logged into her personal savings portal. This was her line in the sand. $50,000. Her father's legacy. She watched the loading circle spin. It felt like an eternity. Finally, the page snapped into view. Balance, $112.42. Sarah's breath hitched. No. She scrolled through the recent activity. A massive withdrawal had been processed 3 hours ago. A legal medical power of attorney lien. Mark had intentionally let their premium insurance policy lapse last month. He'd forgotten to pay the bill, he'd told her. But he hadn't forgotten. He'd waited until the policy was canceled, then scheduled this emergency surgery. Because they were still legally married, and he had designated her as the primary guarantor, the hospital's billing system had automatically triggered a seizure of her linked personal funds to cover the uninsured surgical deposit. He had used her own inheritance to pay for the surgery that would save his life so he could leave her. He had made her pay for his betrayal. A sob rose in her throat, sharp and jagged, but she choked it back. She couldn't afford to cry. Crying was a luxury for people who still had a home to go to. She leaned her head against the cold metal of the stall door. Above her, in the ceiling vents, she heard a faint, rhythmic clicking. Click, click, pause. Click, click, pause. It sounded like a mechanical insect, or perhaps the cooling of the building's massive lungs. But it was too regular, too deliberate. She stood up, her eyes narrowing. She remembered Mark talking about asset protection firms, the kind of people who didn't just use lawyers, but used technicians. She stepped out of the restroom, her skin crawling. The hospital hallway felt different now. The fluorescent lights seemed brighter, harsher. She looked up at the Wi-Fi routers mounted every 30 feet on the ceiling. Little blue lights blinked in unison. She was being tracked. The iPhone David had taken, It was still associated with her Apple ID. They were using the hospital's internal network to triangulate her position. They knew she was on the second floor. They knew she was moving. She began to walk, then to trot. She needed to get to the basement, to the industrial areas where the concrete was thick and the signals were weak. As she rounded the corner toward the service elevators, she saw them. The process server from the stairs, his knee now in a rigid brace, and a hospital security guard with a face like a bulldog. The guard was holding a radio, his thumb hovering over the talk button. "There she is," the process server shouted, pointing a shaking finger. "Ma'am, stop right there." The guard bellowed, his heavy boots thudding against the linoleum. Sarah bolted. She didn't think, she just ran. She dived through a pair of double doors marked "Authorized Personnel Only." Kitchen. The heat hit her first, a wall of steam and the smell of boiled cabbage and industrial dish soap. Dozens of workers in white aprons moved like ghosts through the mist. Large stainless steel vats bubbled with mystery stews, and the roar of the exhaust fans made communication impossible. "Hey, you can't be in here," a cook yelled, but Sarah ignored him. She slid across a floor slick with grease, dodging a cart piled high with plastic trays. She saw the guard burst through the doors behind her. He was shouting into his radio, his face flushed a deep, angry red. Sarah looked for an exit, but the kitchen was a labyrinth of prep tables and humming refrigerators. To her left, a massive steel door stood ajar, a cloud of frost rolling out from the gap. The walk-in cold storage. She dived inside and pulled the heavy handle. The door clicked shut with a finality that made her heart stop. Silence. The temperature plummeted. It was 10 degrees below zero, a dry, biting cold that instantly turned her breath into thick, white plumes. Rows of frozen carcasses hung from meat hooks, swaying slightly in the draft from the cooling units. She leaned against the door, listening. She heard the muffled shouting of the guard, the bang of pots and pans, and then silence. She was trapped, but she was hidden. She pulled the iPhone. No, she didn't have the phone. She had her tablet. She sat on a crate of frozen peas, her fingers already beginning to numb. She needed to find something, anything, to use against them. She opened the cached files on her tablet. Before the phone had been taken, she'd synced a single encrypted folder. She'd thought it was just more financial data. She bypassed the simple encryption. Mark was always lazy with his secondary backups. The file opened. It wasn't a bank statement. It was a birth certificate and a series of old scanned letters. Elena Miller. Sarah's eyes widened as she read the names of the parents. They were the same as Mark's. Elena wasn't a mistress. She wasn't a secret girlfriend. She was Mark's biological sister, given up for adoption 40 years ago. A secret the Miller family had buried under layers of prestige and lies. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was a blood pact. Mark and Elena were reuniting to reclaim the Miller purity, and Sarah was the stain that needed to be erased. They weren't just taking her money. They were taking her life to build a new one on the bones of the old family secrets. Sarah is seeing the truth, she whispered, her voice cracking in the freezing air. The cold was beginning to bite now, a sharp pain in her fingertips and ears. She looked around the room, her eyes landing on a small service hatch near the floor, meant for cleaning out the drainage system. It was small. It was filthy. But it led out. The laundry chute was a vertical tunnel of darkness that smelled of sour bleach and old sweat. Sarah tumbled through it, her body striking the sides until she landed with a muffled oomph in a mountain of lukewarm, damp sheets. She lay there for a moment, her breath coming in jagged gasps, the smell of industrial detergent filling her lungs. Sarah is down, she whispered, her voice trembling. Sarah is in the basement. She crawled out of the bin, her clothes wrinkled and damp. Above her, the hospital hummed with a frantic energy. She checked a wall clock near the service elevators. 12:45 p.m. Panic flared in her chest. A nurse's voice echoed down the hallway from a nearby intercom. Dr. Aris to Recovery Room 4. Patient Miller, Mark, is being moved. Surgery concluded ahead of schedule. 40 minutes early. The window she thought she had, the 2 hours of post-operative silence, had vanished. Mark would be awake soon. Once he was conscious, he would sign the final papers, and the legal version of her life would be deleted forever. She needed the phone. She needed the vault. She moved through the basement like a shadow, avoiding the main corridors. She found a small satellite library used by medical students, a quiet, wood-paneled room tucked away in the west wing. It was empty, the air smelling of old paper and dust. She sat at a back carrel and pulled out the tablet. She had one more trick. She'd installed a remote access Find My Device app on Mark's phone months ago, disguised as a battery optimizer. She'd done it because he was always losing things. But now it was her only tether to the truth. She logged in. The map showed a pulsing blue dot on the 4th floor. The chapel. Why was David or Elena in the chapel? Sarah didn't wait to wonder. She took the stairs 3 at a time, her lungs burning. She reached the 4th floor and slipped into the chapel. The room was dim, lit only by the flickering glow of prayer candles and the harsh white light filtering through the clear glass eyes of the stained glass saints. The pews were bolted to the floor, all facing the back wall. A strange, unsettling arrangement that made the altar feel like a stage for an empty play. In the front row, a woman sat alone. She was ramrod straight, her hair pulled back so tight it looked painful. Elena. She wasn't praying. She was holding Mark's phone, her thumb hovering over the screen. "I knew you'd come," Elena said without turning around. Her voice was like dry parchment. "Mark always said you were predictable. A fixer. You can't help yourself, can you, Sarah?" Sarah stepped into the center aisle, her shadow long and jagged on the marble floor. "He's your brother, Elena. You're helping him destroy a woman who did nothing but love him for 12 years. For what? A payout." Elena stood, turning slowly. Her eyes were cold, void of any empathy. "It's not about the money. It's about the name. You were a mistake, Sarah. A commoner, he used to climb the ladder. Now he's at the top and he doesn't need the ladder anymore." She reached into her coat and pulled out a small black device. A taser. The twin electrodes glinted in the candlelight. "Give me the tablet, Sarah. Let's end this quietly." "No," Sarah said, her voice steadying. "The truth is already out, Elena. I know who you are." Elena's face contorted. "You know nothing." She lunged. Sarah dived between the pews, the wood biting into her shoulder. The taser hissed, a blue spark jumping through the air where her head had been a second before. They scrambled on the floor, a desperate, silent brawl beneath the heavy wooden benches. Elena was stronger, her movements fueled by a lifetime of resentment. But Sarah was desperate. Sarah grabbed a heavy brass candle snuffer from a nearby stand and swung it. It caught Elena on the wrist, and the taser clattered across the floor, sliding under a radiator. Sarah kicked it away and lunged for the phone, which had fallen from Elena's lap. She grabbed it, her fingers slick with sweat. "You can't open it," Elena screamed, clutching her bruised wrist. "It's locked." Sarah ignored her. She fled the chapel, her heart hammering against her ribs. She ducked into a small supply closet 3 doors down, locking it from the inside. She looked at the screen. A folder labeled Leverage sat in the center of the display. She tapped it. Authentication required. Biometric scan. A small icon of a thumbprint appeared. Sarah felt a cold wave of despair. It didn't want a passcode. It wanted Mark, the physical presence of the man who was currently unconscious in a recovery room. And then the screen changed. A red countdown timer appeared at the top. Security breach detected. Remote wipe initiated. 0500 0459. No, Sarah whispered. No. David or Elena had triggered a dead man's switch. The failed login attempts, the struggle, the system had decided to burn the evidence rather than let it be seen. The forged post-nuptial agreement, the embezzlement records, they were dissolving into binary code right in her hands. She had the evidence. She was holding the smoking gun, and it was turning to ash. Sarah is failing, she whispered. The closet felt like it was shrinking, the smell of floor wax and stale air suffocating her. She had 5 minutes. 5 minutes to reach Mark, to force his thumb onto the glass or lose everything. She burst out of the closet and ran toward the recovery wing, her vision blurring. She didn't care about the guards anymore. She didn't care about the process server. She was a woman with 5 minutes of life left, and she was going to spend them fighting. The recovery ward was a forest of plastic curtains and the rhythmic hiss-click of ventilators. Sarah moved with a frantic, focused energy, her eyes scanning the room numbers. 412, 414. Hey, you! She saw the bulldog-faced guard at the end of the hall. He was reaching for his holster. Sarah didn't stop. She didn't even look back. She threw herself onto the floor, sliding across the polished linoleum, and shrieked at the top of her lungs. Help! My chest! I can't breathe! She convulsed, her limbs flailing, a perfect imitation of a grand mal seizure she'd seen in a medical drama years ago. The guard hesitated, his training clashing with his orders. A nurse ran out of a side room, her face pale. Code blue, lobby entrance, the nurse shouted. In the confusion, Sarah rolled under a gurney and scrambled toward room 418. She slipped inside and clicked the lock. Mark lay in the bed, his face a sickly shade of gray. A ventilator tube was taped to his mouth, and a dozen wires snaked out from under his gown. The monitor above him showed a steady, mechanical heartbeat. Beep, beep, beep. The phone in her hand buzzed. 0112, 0111. Mark, she whispered, her voice a jagged edge. Wake up. His eyes flickered. He groaned, a low, wet sound. He looked at her, his pupils dilated from the anesthesia, his gaze wandering. Sarah? He mumbled, the words slurred. What? Where? You're in the hospital, Mark, and you're going to help me. She grabbed his right hand. It was cold, the skin feeling like damp parchment. She pressed his thumb against the screen of the iPhone. Access denied. Retry. Come on, you bastard, she hissed. She wiped the glass on her sleeve, her heart thundering. She pressed his thumb again, harder this time. Authentication successful. The red timer vanished. The leverage folder popped open. Sarah's fingers moved with a speed born of a decade of administrative excellence. She didn't just look at the files, she acted. She selected the forged post-nuptial agreement, the one with her signature perfectly faked. She selected the ledger of the $3 million embezzlement from Mark's own law firm, the one he'd intended to pin on her. She hit share. She BCC'd the entire package to Robert Chen, the senior partner at Miller and Associates. She sent it to the district attorney's office. She sent it to her own private email. Sending. The progress bar crawled. 10%. 20%. Outside the door, she heard the heavy thud of the guard's shoulder against the wood. Open up, now! 30%. 40%. Mark's eyes cleared for a moment. He looked at the phone, then at her. He saw the screen. He saw the name Robert Chen. What are you doing? He croaked, his hand feebly trying to pull away. I'm fixing the record, Mark, Sarah said. Her voice was calm now, a cold, still lake. I'm making sure the history books get it right. 80%, 90%. The door splintered. The guard burst in, followed by the process server and a frantic-looking nurse. Get away from him, the guard shouted, lunging for her. Sarah stood her ground. She held the phone up like a trophy. Message sent. She dropped the phone onto Mark's chest. It bounced once and lay still. The room flooded with people. Police officers, doctors, the senior partner Robert Chen himself, who had been in the building to check on his star lawyer. Chen stood at the foot of the bed, his silver hair impeccable, his silk tie perfectly straight. He looked at the tablet Sarah handed him, the one that had just received the BCC. He scrolled through the documents, his face turning a stony, ashen gray. Mark? Chen asked, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. What is the meaning of this ledger? These are the escrow accounts from the Sterling merger. Mark looked at his boss, then at Sarah. The salesman's pivot failed him. The words wouldn't come. He cracked his knuckles, thumb, index, pinky. But the sound was hollow, a death knell in the sterile room. It was Sarah. Mark wheezed, his eyes darting. She's unstable. She's trying to frame me. Robert Chen looked at the timestamp on the forged agreement. He looked at the digital footprint of the transfers. He was a man who lived by the law, and the law was written in the code Sarah had just unspooled. The record will show, Sarah said, her voice echoing in the sudden silence, that Mark Miller is the architect of his own ruin. Sarah Miller is just the witness. She walked past the guards, past the process server who shrank away from her, and past Elena, who stood in the doorway, her face a mask of shattered ambition. Sarah stepped out of the hospital entrance. The Manhattan sunrise was a bruised purple and orange, the air fresh and cool against her skin. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her own phone, the one she'd managed to reclaim from the chapel floor after the struggle. She found Mark's contact. She didn't hesitate. Delete. She watched the name vanish. She watched the digital ghost of her marriage disappear into the ether. Sarah is free, she whispered. She didn't need a recorder to know it was the truth. She walked toward the subway, her head held high, the sound of the city waking up a symphony of a new beginning. She had no money in her account, no car in the garage, and no husband in her bed. But for the first time in 12 years, Sarah Miller had herself. And that was more than enough to start over.